Hello, reality sandwich community. Kyle, one of your favorite conscious agents, back with another amazing share your experience interview, joined by the wonderful Jim Cubensis today. Jim, how's it going?
It's going fantastic. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, wonderful to connect. You've expressed you've been a reality sandwich follower and fan for a long time, so happy to have you on to share your experience with us today.
Yep.
Could
Love
we
everything you put out.
could we get into briefly, what was were you spawned from the mycelium underneath our feet? What was your interest and experience, wanting to jump into mycology and learning deeper about fungi?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I feel like at a certain extent, everyone is somewhat derived from the mycelium, right? Because if you think back to before there was life on land, it had to get there somehow. And current research would have us believe that fungi played a huge role in that, if not the main role. So, got to pay our respects to the fungi. And what got me interested personally into the world of natural plant medicines and those kinds of things was first of all just experiencing them without having any prior knowledge. And I knew of the caliber of kind of experience that you might have if you were to consume something like that. I just had never experienced it. So to go from someone that is unexperienced to thrust into the experience is quite a lot, right? And I've had the fortunate ability now in the last, I'd say, 2 years to experience these medicines in such a way that is, I would say, um, more intentional and a little bit more, I think, healing and insightful, as opposed to the first time or times when I did experience. So that's kind of how I've found myself here.
Were you a big like cannabis consumer when you were younger? What kind of got you on that first step towards educating yourself about plant medicines and eventually taking that journey to wanting to try, the mushrooms themselves?
Yeah. So I was a huge cannabis user, actually. Um, and some people say to this day I look perma-stoned, but it could just be my calm demeanor. But I was a big cannabis user in my like kind of late teens, early 20s. And I probably was like consuming cannabis regularly for about year and a half, 2 years before I tried magic mushrooms for the first time. Um, and then after I tried magic mushrooms, I was still a cannabis user. I sort of weaned off of the cannabis, I'd say 3, 4 years ago now at this point, and I don't really smoke at all. On like the very rare occasions will I smoke, but it's definitely reached a different experience as opposed to when I first started smoking. When I first started smoking, it, I think, unlocked so many different creative outlets for me, and it allowed me to like really appreciate a lot of the finer things in life, and even the not so fine things. It was still like letting me appreciate. And now I feel like I kind of have that, or at least I like to think I have that mentality when I'm not smoking cannabis, or like I try to cultivate that while I'm sober. And then with mushrooms, it's like a different experience altogether where it's like, I know this is going to be uncomfortable potentially, but I'm still going to go do the thing because it's sort of like the feeling you get on the other side is kind of like a after a hard workout, you're like, yay, I did it. So I do still find value in all the medicines, but especially in the sort of short-lived but intense ones like magic mushrooms or what have you.
Could you walk me through that first experience? Were you going in with intention and some sort of healing ceremony? Walk me through the setting of your first psilocybin
Yeah.
experience.
Well, my very first psilocybin experience, it's not the one I would sort of go into detail into like someone who was maybe uninitiated with, but those I had later on. But for my very first one, it wasn't a bad trip. It was also sort of just, I'd say it's like it was a really strong neutral, like a super strong neutral. And it was a super hot day. I think it was 100 degrees plus out. And I was at a friend's
Oh,
house,
geez.
and the friend's house that I was at did not have air conditioning for whatever reason. Um, and it's not because we were just too high to know how to turn it on. I think it just like wasn't working. And it was my first time. It was my friend's first time, and then our other friend who was sort of like the sitter, if you will. And I just remember, first of all, like the texture on my hair felt very, very new and like different. I didn't ever hadn't ever experienced like the texture of my hair. Obviously, the visuals were very intense, and I was amazed at how all of a sudden like the wall can move, whereas before it never did. Even if I was super stoned, the wall would never move, but suddenly on mushrooms it does. I remember I took a shower, obviously, because it was so hot, and while taking a shower, remembering having the feeling of like ancient ancestral something going on. There were like, I felt like I was in the pyramids in a sense, where there was like, it was a weird kind of like bath. Someone was like bathing me, but not just one person. It felt like there were like at least a dozen people that were like a part of this bathing experience. So I let that one ride out for a little while, and then uh, yeah, getting out of that, it sort of started going a little, I'd say, in a different direction. Once my friend started having a bit of a tough time where he was at, and I was sort of naturally like, oh, let me help him. And then I was like, wait a minute, I'm still deep in this myself. But I still tried to like be there. And like the extent to which I could be there for him was like, I just sort of sat on the floor next to him and like maybe gave him like some back rubs or something like that. But we got through it. Everyone made it out okay. But again, like that's not the experience that I'd say is representative of
Mhm.
like the ideal experience, and that just goes to show too the ability for these things to rock your world in such a way that you should like, I think it's important, and I'm not saying it's the whole thing, but it's important to sort of have like a prior knowledge to what it is that you're getting yourself into, because they do have the ability to have like really profound impacts. Um, but sometimes the
Right.
only way to know
Test
is,
drive first before you commit.
yeah, you could do that, like I
So,
mentioned
so
earlier.
from that, take what did you take away from that experience? Then how did you process that, integrate that, and now when you were ready for perhaps a true intention going into the profound experience that you wanted to have next time.
Yeah. Well, it took me a few times to get to that time. I think I had to go through that experience more or less a few times before realizing this. Like I need to do something different, right? Like so I would say there were maybe 3 or 4 trips that were similar, in a similar vein to that.
Mhm.
And then, of course, I also tried like some microdoses along the way, which were more often than not sub-perceptual, but some of them were actually a little bit perceptual. But mostly it was sort of the same experience where I'd go through it. It was really intense. I'd come out of it and I'd recognize that I had gone through something intense, but I wouldn't have any of these like profound insights that I had heard people have had experiencing with these. And so it was really I think the idea that I had heard and sort of watched as other people were having these profound changes in their lives from these things. And I was still kind of just like using them as like a recreational, I don't know. And I think there's a place and time for a recreational purpose. But I do think, like, for me at that point, I had only had the recreational, I had never had the medicinal. So I was at a point where I sort of forced myself to seek out the medicinal aspect of it. Um, and unfortunately, I was led to a place that also set up that environment. Um, Actually, two places. So I had kind of two experiences that were, I'd say, 4 months apart. The first being kind of like a mini macro dose. It's definitely like a macro dose. And then the second one also being kind of like a mini macro dose, but also still kind of a macro dose. The first one was in Oaxaca and the mountains of San Jose del Pacifico there, where it's just like it's the thing. Everyone who goes there immediately is offered, like, do you want to? It's like mushrooms are everywhere in the mountains of San Jose del Pacifico, and it's on indigenous lands. So the indigenous population there has no like there's no well, don't quote me on this, but like the repercussions of consuming like a quote unquote illegal substance on those lands is not as enforced because of the fact that it's an ancestral part. It's like a part of their people and like their culture and history. So it's looked at a little differently, and it also allows for people to just like visit and experience those things if they choose to do so, and they're willing to accept whatever could happen from that. But that was the first one, and then the second time after that was in Guatemala. But we could dive into either of those if you want.
Yeah, which one did you take the most away from, would you say? What profound experience do you feel called to share?
Yeah. The so both were very insightful. I'd say that both had a lot of good things to pull from them, and they were also treated a little differently. So I'll start with the one in Oaxaca in San Jose del Pacifico. I was with a group of my friends, um, and I would say there were maybe 5 or 6 of us. And I had the intention, I knew that I wanted to be more intentional with this one. So, and I had a feeling my friends were maybe on that wave, maybe not. But regardless, I had the intention of as soon as I consumed the mushrooms, I was going to basically just go off on my own and find a place where I could just like be alone and like kind of try to go inward. So that's what I did. And fortunately, in the mountains of San Jose del Pacifico, it's set up where you basically just have like a foresty playground in a sense. It's definitely pretty. Well, the place we were at, it's a mountain, so there are some inclines, but you kind of meander your way through. And so we consumed it in a tea. All of us had a tea. A local woman made it for us, and they were freshly picked. Like I was drinking the tea, chewing the mushrooms, and there was like dirt and the mushrooms in the tea still because it's like someone had just pulled them. So they were fresh mushrooms.
Mhm.
I believe I can't be for certain, but I'm pretty sure if I was in Oaxaca, there's plenty of mushrooms that grow down there species wise. Um, This is before I had like the sort of knowledge, but I believe they were Psilocybe mexicanas, but I could be wrong. But anyways, we consumed it as a group, and then I went off on my own, and I found this one stump. It was a tree stump, and the tree stump was so it like when something in the world kind of just speaks to you. It's like, hey, you and I were meant to just, have something. There's like a connection here. And that's how I felt with this tree stump. And so I kind of like crawled my way up, and it was on the top of this little mound that was still on the side of this mountain, but like somehow this mound was its own little hill. And I noticed on the stump that there were mushrooms growing off of that. And the mushrooms that grow up at that high of elevation, we were probably 9,000 feet or 3,000 meters up. And the mushrooms that grow up there, because of the climate that happens and just like the chaos of it all, it's a beautiful chaos. they are some of the coolest looking mushrooms I've ever seen. And that's what was growing on this tree stump. And so I was like, oh, this is the perfect stump for me to go and go inward. So I just like sat myself down, leaned up against the stump, still being respectful not to, mess with the mushrooms that were growing on it. And basically just sat there for what must have been maybe an hour, could have been 3. I'm not entirely sure, but I just like closed my eyes for a portion of it, and I was just kind of like experiencing all of these different, I don't know if I want to call them thoughts, but they were definitely like feelings and things. And I also remember the breathing, like my breath. We were also super high up, so that had something to do with it. Just being so high up, the oxygen is different up there. But remember breathing and just feeling like it was the deepest breaths I had ever taken, and I was like, I felt this sense of release when I would exhale, and it was this really calming release. And I don't know how my mind went into this direction, but then I had this connection of that release to the thought of like what basically what dying might feel like. And so I kind of like I correlated the two, this like really amazing feeling of just being like totally at ease and relaxed and just free of tension with this kind of, negative idea that we sometimes avoid talking about, which is death. And I remember once those two were connected, it allowed me to sort of take a different perspective on the dying element. And I think for for the rest of the trip, it wasn't so, I guess, insightful. That was like probably the biggest sort of insight there was like, oh wow, you know, to die is to simply be let go of from all this tension that we experience in our lives, whether it be good or bad. And that was a really like, it was really like a boosting thought, because then I was like, well, then all this stuff I'm doing now, no matter how hard it might feel or whatever in the moment, one day it's all going to be released. And so I kind of just carried that with me. And I remember towards the end of the experience, we were sitting at a cafe in San Jose. The town of San Jose del Pacifico has a lot of different cool places with amazing views of the valley and the mountains below. So we're sitting at one of these cafes with such a view, and I'm with, at this point, it was, I think, 3 of my friends. And we were just, having a good time. It started raining, and we were covered, sitting on the patio, looking out as like the clouds were just like, moving over the mountains, thinking this is the coolest thing ever. And I brought this idea up to one of my friends of like, because we were talking about our experiences, and this was the come down, and I was like, yeah, I thought about death. And then my friend was like, what? Like, they were like, what do you mean? Like, and they got a little like apprehensive. And then I was like, no, 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 like, it's not a bad thing. And then I tried to make this analogy, or like, I tried to replace the word death with like a more friendly word so that we could talk about it and have a conversation. So I used the word tacos. And so I was like, we should talk about tacos, whatever else. And that's some that like kind of helped. It wasn't like it didn't really, but yeah, I think it's so that also that's a lesson that we each have to learn these lessons on our own. And so I think that was a lesson I learned on that experience.
Yeah, it's hard to communicate post transcendent experience there for sure. You got to
Yeah,
internalize
I
the.
don't know why my
How did you integrate post that trip and experience, and then roll that into the your next more profound one?
yeah. Well, integration wise, I remained in Oaxaca actually after that for about 2 months,
Oh wow.
and my friends had left. Yeah, my friends left maybe a week after that. So I was basically living alone in Oaxaca. Not alone, but like on my own. Um, and I did actually, in fact, I took up a hobby that I'm not typically engaging in, and that's drawing. I found, funny enough, at like a taco shop, I found a dude who was like a former. drawing instructor or teacher, and I basically started taking like these lessons with him. We'd go around the city of Oaxaca and basically just like start drawing random stuff. But he had like a really great way of teaching, and so I do that. But I don't know if that was related to my experience of like go through the tension, try to do the hard thing of drawing, which I feel like drawing is one of the most, I don't know, it's like just such a really unique and hard, challenging, at least to me, thing. But it's such a beautiful output that you get. That was maybe one. But then the next experience in Guatemala was, I would say it was a combination of reflection and celebration. I remember the leading up into it, I had the intention of like being grateful for the things that I had learned because it happened at the end of a week long course down there in Guatemala that's basically all about mushroom cultivation.
Mhm.
And so I remember I was like, let's first be grateful for all the knowledge that I just like gained, and then my second intention was to celebrate all of the knowledge that I gained. And so for that one, basically the first 3 hours, I was again kind of introspective and just sort of like sat there with my eyes closed, which for me, I feel like is a very effective way of, if I want to have a more insightful experience, to just simply sit there
Mhm.
and close my eyes and try to shut out like external stimulus. Because the less external stimulus that you experience, it's like the more you can kind of feel what's going on. Um, but then, yeah, the second part of that, I was like drinking really old tea with one of the instructors there, and we were like playing funky music and eating fruit, just having a good time. Um, so it was a kind of like nice combination of the two.
Excellent. Well, you seem to be a naturally curious person, always looking to self improve and educate. What made you want to dive into educating yourself about growing mushrooms? What do you take away from that? How do you share that experience with your community?
Yeah, so I guess the mushroom growing desire came from this fact that like I had experienced and been around mushrooms, and it was something that I knew of, but I didn't really know. It's kind of like if you have a friend or an acquaintance that you really admire,
Mhm.
and you don't know anything about like who they are or like how they were brought up, and it's like, damn, I wish I could know more about that person, um, just to have a sense of like a better sense of who they are, and kind of that's I think what led me into it, and I'm glad I went down that little rabbit hole that I did, because not only did I learn how to, how like these things work on a basic sense, but I also got to meet and like experience so many cool people and things that I don't think I ever would have had I not gone down that path. And it was yeah, it's just been like a wild ride ever since deciding like I'm gonna learn this. And it isn't anything that I would have imagined myself learning as a kid. I was not very into mushrooms at all. I was a very picky eater, never ate like anything besides chicken nuggets. So the fact that I'm now like trying to grow my own food and medicine, and it's coming from dirt, is pretty different from what 13-year-old me thought I'd be doing.
What shocked you most when diving into being educated about growing mushrooms?
Uh, yeah, honestly, and this might come off as like wrong, but like how easy it is. I don't think it's necessarily that hard. I mean, if your goal is to grow fungus, like you can kind of get away with it pretty easily. Whether or not that fungus is the fungus you wanted to grow is up for debate. But yeah, I mean, as long as you are able to follow just some basic steps and procedures, you'll be able to get it. And once I think too, once the whatever grain or whatever thing you're using is like the spawn element, as soon as that thing is 100% colonized, so meaning it is just like 100% white or whatever color based on the mushroom variety you have. Once that thing is fully colonized, it's basically built up this immune system. And the immune system, like humans' immune system, is not great. Well, it's not. I'm sorry, it's not like flawless, but it's pretty good. And so you can kind of be more lenient with that. And I really that lesson was really driven home when during that same course we went to a local Mayan woman who had been cultivating mushrooms like for the last 10 years on the
Mhm.
lake in Guatemala. And the way she did it was so just bare bones that I was like, if she can grow mushrooms in this environment, then like anyone can grow mushrooms. And really the key was she started with the spawn. And so like she was careful about how she got to the spawn stage. But once she got there, she was like opening the jar outside, like taking her hands and like throwing it into the bag of substrate that she was going to eventually inoculate. Like not following, still air box, none of that, like no flow hood. And so she was able to do it. And like her contamination rate was, I'm pretty sure on average, it's probably under like 5%, which is pretty ridiculous, for her methods. So that was definitely a shock when it came to the mushroom growing process and cycle.
Something we have done a pretty deep dive on Reality Sandwich, but again, there's still a lot of educating to be done to the wider community. People think, how do I grow mushrooms or how do mushrooms propagate? They think spores, but what a lot of out there is what people call liquid culture. Could you describe to me the difference between spores and liquid culture and what that might mean to somebody?
Yeah. So spores, mushroom spores, those are the things that mushrooms are going to basically try and get to fly as far away as possible or blow up into the air or try to get something to eat them to carry them as far away as possible. And they're basically like these little micro sized cells that, if given the right conditions, can germinate and then eventually they'll form what is called like this mycelium that we sometimes have heard referred to. And basically, once you have mycelium, that mycelium, you can think of it as like it is pretty equatable to plants, whereas like spores are like seeds, and then mycelium is kind of like roots. So basically, like the mycelium is the root of the mushroom, and then that part will grow out. But I would say mycelium is a lot more advanced than a root in the sense that it can just like the ability for it to grow and expand. And maybe roots are like this too. Actually, I shouldn't say I don't know a lot about roots, but I would say that mycelium you can definitely expand out and get this massive like network basically. And so that's a spore would sort of spawn mycelium. A liquid culture is basically taking some of that mycelium that's already formed and then putting it in a liquid form, usually containing some other kind of nutrient. I don't know, like a common nutrient you might use, just be like sugar, honey, or a lot of people use light malt extract, and basically having a solution that's water with that little sugar food source. And then you put the mycelium, you just kind of like add it to it. And over time, what will happen is that mycelium is going to continue to grow and it'll grow inside of that solution that you've made. So that's why sometimes if you're like, if you've ever bought in spores or if you've ever bought in liquid culture and maybe you didn't know the difference, you see spore syringes, and spore syringes are usually clear with like these black specks, if you even can see the black specks. A liquid culture is essentially, it's also like in a syringe or vial form, and it's usually like colored because typically that's like the sugar. It's like either yellow or other colors, not, it's usually not clear. And then you'll see like this almost cloud like structure that's like floating in there. usually white. Um, and so that's the difference. And then spores and liquid culture, they essentially do the same thing, right? If you wanted to grow mushrooms with both, you could. With spores, it takes a little bit longer to get the germinating to happen, right? Because you have to still germinate spores. Whereas with liquid culture, you kind of just are ready from the get go if you're looking to expand it. So it'll start expanding on whatever you put it into, like right away. But yeah, you can use both, and there's a reason in time where you'd want to use one over the other. Usually, liquid culture is taking a clone of an already existing mushroom. And so, if you were to just simply use a liquid culture again and again, you're kind of like you're losing that like genetic variation that you might get when you use a spore, because spores can spawn something completely new. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, if you're just like a first time person looking to grow mushrooms, I'd say that liquid culture is a great place to start. But you could use spores as well. It's up to you. Kind of challenge.
What do you find is your preferred growing medium? Some people prefer some sort of soil substrate mix. Some people like to go all grain. And do you find a difference between using the different mediums?
Yeah, so the different mediums are something that I haven't experimented too much with personally. I will say that I've found some genetics that, and it might be common, but they'll just fruit on grain. Like if you just add it to grain, when usually you're adding that substrate on top of that, there's some strains where you don't even need to add substrate; it'll fruit out. It's gonna fruit all kind of weird, and it's not gonna be the best that it could be, but yeah, it will. And typically the grain is pretty standard. It's just like your straight rye grain. You can use like the popcorn kernels. Some people do that.
Hmm.
You can kind of use, there's like a lot of common ways you can do that. I met a guy recently who was describing to me his way of cultivating mushrooms, and he basically had experimented with it a lot more, and he found that elephant poop, specifically elephant poop from Texas, I guess he had a guy that would source it from Texas and ship it to him. So he got elephant poop literally shipped to his door, and he'd have to like dehydrate it, or it might have already been dehydrated at this point, but basically like dehydrated elephant poop. That was what he was using as the main
Hmm.
um, either. I don't even know if he used grain. I think he might have just used the poop. But he was saying that like he's found in feedback from people that he was like giving the mushrooms to, that these mushrooms were like extremely like really good mushrooms basically. And I found that to be interesting. I haven't ever experienced with using different kinds of poops, but I would say that when it does come to the medium use, that's really important. When you're creating a liquid culture, I would say it doesn't matter as much whether or not you have all these like fancy, different like peptones and things in your culture mix. I would say when it really does matter about your ingredients and what you use comes in when you get to the fruiting and like the colonizing stage, where it does matter. But for me, I've really just stuck to the basics. The CVG, I believe they call it, which is cocoa coir, vermiculite, and gypsum.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Pretty strong combo there. That's, with sometimes the cannabis, that's what they use as well.
Hmm.
Curious, how often do you find yourself growing mushrooms at home? Are you focused more on growing the psilocybin varietals in medicine, or do you find yourself more getting into the gourmet edible stuff for cooking?
Yeah, I would say it's been a lot of the magical varieties for
Mhm.
sure. However, this summer I like to grow it during the hotter months, just
Mhm.
because I don't have to run the heater as
Mhm.
much, because I don't have any sort of heating element, and they like it a certain degree, a certain temperature range. This summer, I want to try to grow some more gourmet varieties, and start to impress some friends with my fried up lion's mane nuggets.
Mhm.
I got really good at this. It was like an oyster butter
Mm.
dish, and it was super simple. It's been a while since I made it. I think parsley. So yeah, cooking mushrooms. I think honestly, I get more fun from cooking mushrooms sometimes than I do from actually taking the mushrooms that make you go into the void. So it's definitely like a mix of the two, I'd say.
How do you educate friends and family about cooking with mushrooms and getting them to change their palates a little bit?
If I can, I'll make it for them,
Hmm.
because I feel like there's this like because personally I've made this recipe for people who have like been like, I don't like mushrooms, and they're like, whoa, like, this is really good. So I'll make them this one dish. I think you really just need one dish
Hmm.
for people to change their minds, and the amount of different mushroom recipes out there, like for all different kinds of mushrooms, there's dishes for everyone. So I think it starts with knowing what the person you're trying to change, not change their mind, but influence very subtly, like knowing what they like to begin with, and then just crafting a recipe around that kind of thing could work. Or you can just add a ton of butter and be like, here you
Right.
go. And like, you're going to like this. I promise. Um, so you can do either of those things.
When I talk to people, I think we're still in the world of when you say mushrooms, people's mind either goes to, psychedelic magic mushrooms, or they're thinking of the plain white or brown mushrooms you would still find in most supermarkets here.
I'd say that's pretty fair to assume, leaving out all the stuff in between and the stuff that we haven't discovered.
The dish that really rocked my world, I went to a fancy restaurant in Beverly Hills one time, and they had a vegan chicken and waffle dish. And the vegan chicken was I believe it was a fried enoki mushroom, but man, that thing, I thought I was eating real chicken tenders. It was that good.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
If you have the name of that spot, I'd be very keen to know if I'm ever in the area.
Well, Jim, where can people follow you? Where can they, continue to get educated by you, and what's been keeping you inspired as you evolve not only your education, but what you want to share with the larger mushroom and curious community?
Yeah, so I do publish articles occasionally on things like Substack or Medium. I'm on Twitter at Jim Cubensis. My handle is the same for most of these channels. So if you go on whatever you use and just look up Jim Cubensis, if I'm there, you'll maybe find me. But yeah, and most of the articles I publish have to do with like more of like psychedelic responsibility, kind of like the educational part around the ways at which you could go about experiencing these things, as well as just random. It's kind of all over the map, but yeah, uh, cool stuff.
I'd love for you as well to share your interpretation or your point of view on the current state of the mushroom industry, whether we're talking about these gourmet grow kits, people getting into psilocybin, is there room for everybody in this market? We've got people still doing basic plastic grow bags versus these fancy boxes coming out versus just selling, these products in pill or gummy form. We
Yeah,
just love where the your take on where the industry has grown, where it's heading, and where you feel responsible for educating.
yeah. The I think the piece to address first and foremost is the spawning of like the various kind of gummy companies.
Hmm.
Some of them are great, and then a lot of them aren't. And we saw that with the Amanita
Hmm.
regulation going into place, just because like people were getting sick and not having a great time from some of these products that people were selling. So to kind of counteract that, I think having as much variety in the market as you can with these kinds of products, like having the really low tech ways of
Hmm.
growing your own mushrooms and having the super high tech, here's my full on DIY clean room, and
Hmm.
like I'm going to show you all you need to know about growing mushrooms, having a bunch of those people and a bunch of the low tech people. I think the more you have of like just the wide breadth of like skill and knowledge levels, the better, because it shows people who aren't familiar how
Mhm.
different and how unique there. Like, there's just so many different ways that you can go about this whole process of cultivating mushrooms and also consuming mushrooms and cooking mushrooms. Like, all of these different ways exist to experience them, and I think the more people that we have doing it, the better. And I also do I like to view mycology and as a whole, kind of like the Amazon rainforest back in like called the early, was it the early 1900s or like mid 1900s, when like it was the last frontier on Earth that people were exploring, because it was like everything else had been seen, and we had maps for it all except for the Amazon jungle. Like, that was this big, huge
Mhm.
unknown, and I feel like that's where mushrooms are, even though we have such a wide seeming knowledge about them already. I feel like there's just so much we don't know about them. So I think it's just like, get people interested in them and get people talking about them any way that you can. It's good.
Well, Jim, thank you for the time today. Appreciate your passion and education, and excited to continue to follow the things you do in the mycology world.
Thank you, and much appreciated to you and Reality Sandwich for doing what you do, creating such good stuff.